Margaret Thompson had always been meticulous about family history, the kind of person who kept detailed genealogical charts and could recite her ancestry back 4 generations without hesitation. At 52 years old, she worked as a professional genealogist, helping other families trace their roots and solve mysteries about their heritage. She had built her career on the careful analysis of documents, photographs, and family records, approaching each case with the scientific rigor of a detective and the patience of a scholar. So when her grandmother Dorothy passed away at 97 in the spring of 2023, Margaret approached the task of organizing her belongings with the same methodical precision she brought to her professional work. Dorothy had lived in the same house in Salem, Oregon, for over 60 years, accumulating decades' worth of photographs, documents, letters, and family memorabilia that would need to be sorted, cataloged, and distributed among surviving family members. Margaret's relationship with her grandmother had been particularly close, partly because they shared a passion for family history, and partly because Dorothy had served as Margaret's primary caregiver during her early childhood, when Margaret's parents had struggled with financial difficulties and marital problems. Dorothy's house had been a refuge for Margaret during the unstable periods of her youth, and many of her happiest childhood memories were associated with holidays and summers spent under her grandmother's care. The process of sorting through Dorothy's belongings was emotionally difficult, but also historically fascinating. Dorothy had been a meticulous record keeper who had preserved family photographs dating back to the 1920s, along with letters, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and other documents that provided intimate glimpses into the Thompson family's history across multiple generations. Margaret worked through the collection systematically, creating digital scans of important photographs and organizing documents by date and family branch. She had been working in Dorothy's bedroom, going through boxes stored in the closet, when she found a small wooden photo box tucked behind winter coats that hadn't been worn in years. The box contained what appeared to be the oldest photographs in Dorothy's collection, formal family portraits and holiday gatherings from the 1940s and 1950s that Margaret had never seen before. The photographs were in remarkable condition, carefully preserved in individual envelopes with dates and locations written in Dorothy's neat handwriting. Margaret was examining each photograph carefully, identifying family members and making notes for her genealogical records, when she found an image that made her hand shake so violently that she nearly dropped on the floor. The photograph was labeled Thompson Christmas 1943 in Dorothy's handwriting, and showed a large family gathering in what Margaret recognized as Dorothy's living room, decorated for the holidays with a Christmas tree and family members arranged in the formal pose typical of 1940s family photography. Margaret could identify most of the people in the photograph: her great-grandparents, various aunts and uncles, and children who would grow up to become Margaret's parents and their siblings. But standing in the front row, between 2 cousins Margaret recognized from other family photos, was a girl of approximately 8 years old who looked exactly like Margaret herself at that age. The resemblance wasn't the kind of family similarity that people often notice between relatives separated by generations. The child in the photograph was identical to Margaret's own appearance in childhood photographs she had at home: the same facial features, the same hair color and style, the same distinctive smile that Margaret had inherited and passed on her own daughter. Margaret stared at the photograph for several minutes, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The child was wearing a white dress with small flowers embroidered around the collar, and Margaret experienced a strange sense of déjà vu as she looked at it, as if she had seen the dress before but couldn't place where or when. The date on the photograph was clearly marked as 1943, which created an impossible timeline problem. Margaret had been born in 1971, 28 years after the photograph was taken. There was no way she could have been present at a Christmas gathering that occurred before her parents were even teenagers. If this story truly touches your heart, let it speak for you. Like this video, subscribe to be part of our journey, and share your feelings in the comments. Margaret's first assumption was that the photograph showed a cousin or distant relative who bore a strong resemblance to Margaret's childhood appearance. The Thompson family had distinctive features that often appeared across generations. It wasn't uncommon for family members to notice similarities between children born decades apart. But as Margaret examined the photograph more closely, using a magnifying glass to study the details, she noticed features that went beyond normal family resemblance. The child in the photograph had a small scar above her left eyebrow, identical to one Margaret had acquired when she fell off her bicycle at age 7. The child also had a distinctive birthmark on her neck that was visible above the collar of her dress, a birthmark that Margaret had carried her entire life and that she had always been told was unique to her. Most disturbing was the child's expression and posture, which seemed familiar to Margaret in ways that suggested more than genetic similarity. The way the child held her hands, the slight tilt of her head, even particular ways she was smiling. All of these details matched Margaret's own childhood mannerisms and expressions that she recognized from her own family photographs. Margaret spent the rest of the afternoon going through every photograph in Dorothy's collection, looking for other images that might help her understand what she had found. What she discovered was a pattern that defied rational explanation. There were 3 other photographs in the collection that showed the same impossible child at different ages and occasions. A picture labeled Summer 1941 showed a child at approximately 6 years old, playing in Dorothy's backyard with other family members. A formal portrait from Easter 1945 showed the child at around 10 years old, wearing a dress that Margaret remembered owning during her own childhood in the 1980s. Most unnervingly, there was a photograph from Margaret's 7th birthday in 1944 that showed the child blowing out candles on a birthday cake while surrounded by family members celebrating what was clearly a party organized specifically for her. The existence of multiple photographs spanning several years ruled out the possibility of a single mistaken identity or photographic error. Instead, the images appear to document the childhood of someone who looked exactly like Margaret Thompson, living with Margaret's family, during a time period when Margaret had not yet been born. Margaret realized that she needed to verify the authenticity of the photographs before she could begin to understand their implications. She contacted Dr. James Peterson, a forensic photographic analyst who specialized in historical image authentication and who had helped her with difficult cases involving potentially forged family documents. Dr. Peterson examined the photographs using specialized equipment designed to detect signs of digital manipulation or physical alteration. His analysis confirmed that the images were authentic 1940s photographs that had not been tampered with or artificially created. These photographs show all the characteristics of genuine 1940s family photography. Dr. Peterson reported to Margaret the paper, the chemical development process, the lighting and pose conventions. Everything is consistent with photographs taken during that time period. There's no evidence of digital manipulation or composite imaging that would suggest these images were created using modern technology. Dr. Peterson also noted that the photographic quality and aging patterns were consistent with images that had been taken and stored during the 1940s, ruling out the possibility that the photographs had been created recently using vintage techniques or materials. The authentication of the photographs eliminated rational explanations based on forgery or modern deception, but raised even more disturbing questions about how Margaret's childhood appearance could have been documented 28 years before her birth. Margaret decided to expand her investigation by interviewing surviving family members who might remember the events depicted in the photographs. Her Aunt Helen, Dorothy's youngest daughter, was 85 years old and still living independently in Portland. Helen had been a teenager during the 1940s and had clear memories of the family gatherings shown in the mysterious photographs. When Margaret showed Helen the Christmas 1943 photograph, her aunt's reaction was immediate recognition rather than confusion. "Oh my goodness, that's little Margaret," Helen said without hesitation. "I remember that Christmas so well because it was right after your father came back from the war. Margaret was such a sweet child. She was always helping Grandma Dorothy in the kitchen and playing with the younger cousins." Margaret felt her world shift as she listened to her aunt's casual recollections of events that should have been impossible. "Aunt Helen," Margaret said carefully, "I need you to look at this photograph again. This is from 1943, but I wasn't born until 1971. How could I be in this picture?" Helen studied the photograph more carefully, and Margaret watched confusion spread across her aunt's face. "That doesn't make sense," Helen said slowly. "I remember little Margaret from those years. She was always at family gatherings. She lived with Dorothy during the summers, and she was definitely there for that Christmas in 1943. But you're right that you weren't born until much later. I don't understand what I'm looking at." Margaret pressed her aunt for more details about the child in the photographs, and Helen's memories were remarkably specific and consistent. She remembered little Margaret as a quiet, intelligent child who loved to read and help with cooking. She remembered the white flower dress from the Christmas photograph because Margaret had worn it to several family events and had been particularly proud of it. Most significantly, Helen remembered that little Margaret had lived with Dorothy for several years during the 1940s, though she couldn't recall exactly where the child had come from or why she had needed to stay with her grandmother. "I always assumed she was a cousin or a distant relative who needed a place to stay during the war," Helen explained. There were so many children being moved around during those years because of family difficulties or military service. Dorothy never explained the details, and we all just accepted that Margaret was part of family. Margaret interviewed 2 other surviving relatives who had been present during the 1940s, and both confirmed Helen's memories of the mysterious child. Uncle Robert, now 88, remembered playing with little Margaret during family picnics and holiday gatherings. Cousin Patricia, 82, recalled helping organize the birthday party shown in the 1944 photograph. All of the relatives described the child using details that matched Margaret's own childhood personality and interests. They remembered her love of books, her careful handwriting, her tendency to organize games for younger children, and her particular fondness for helping Dorothy with cooking and household tasks. The consistency of these memories, provided by multiple independent sources, confirmed that the child in the photographs had been a real person who had lived with the Thompson family during the 1940s. But it also deepened the mystery of how that child could have been identical to Margaret Thompson in both appearance and personality. Margaret's investigation took a new direction when she decided to examine Dorothy's personal papers for any documentation that might explain the presence of a mysterious child. Dorothy had kept detailed records throughout her life, including address books, financial records, and correspondence that might provide clues about family arrangements during the 1940s. In a box of financial documents from the 1940s, Margaret found monthly expense records that included entries for Margaret's clothing, Margaret's school supplies, and Margaret's medical expenses. The records showed that Dorothy had been supporting a child named Margaret for approximately 4 years, from 1941 to 1945. More significantly, Margaret found a folder containing official documents related to the child, including a birth certificate, school enrollment records, and medical files. The birth certificate was issued in Oregon in 1935, listing the child's name as Margaret Louise Thompson and her parents as unknown. The medical records were particularly disturbing because they documented injuries and treatments that matched Margaret's own childhood medical history. The files showed that the 1940s Margaret had broken her left wrist in a bicycle accident in 1942, received stitches above her left eyebrow after falling from a tree in 1943, and had been treated for pneumonia during the winter of 1944. Margaret remembered each of these medical events from her own childhood in the 1970s and 1980s. She had broken her left wrist in a bicycle accident when she was 7 years old, received stitches above her left eyebrow when she fell from a tree at her grandmother's house, and had been hospitalized with pneumonia during first grade. The medical records from the 1940s included x-rays of the broken wrist and photographs documenting the facial injury, and both show bone and tissue structures that appeared identical to Margaret's own medical records from her childhood injuries. Dr. Sarah Martinez, Margaret's longtime family physician, agreed to compare the historical medical records with Margaret's current medical files. Dr. Martinez had known Margaret for over 20 years and had access to her complete medical history, including childhood injuries and treatments. "This is completely unprecedented," Dr. Martinez told Margaret after reviewing both sets of records. "The bone structure, injury patterns, and healing characteristics are so similar that they could be from the same person. But that's obviously impossible given the timeline involved." Dr. Martinez noted that the 1940s medical records showed the same rare blood type that Margaret carried, as well as identical responses to common medications and treatments. The level of medical similarity went far beyond what could be explained by family genetics or coincidental injury patterns. The accumulating evidence forced Margaret to confront possibilities that challenged her understanding of reality and personal identity. The photographs, witness testimony, and medical records all confirmed that someone identical to Margaret Thompson had lived with her family during the 1940s, decades before Margaret's actual birth. Margaret decided to explore whether there might be some kind of time travel or temporal anomaly that could explain her apparent presence in the past. She contacted Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a physicist at Oregon State University who specialized in theoretical studies of time and temporal mechanics. Dr. Rodriguez listened to Margaret's evidence with scientific skepticism, but she acknowledged that the documentation was more comprehensive than any case of alleged time travel she had previously encountered. From a theoretical physics perspective, Dr. Rodriguez explained, time travel to the past is not impossible, though it would require circumstances and technologies that don't exist with our current understanding of a universe. What's most interesting about your case is the consistency and detail of the evidence across multiple types of documentation. Dr. Rodriguez suggested that Margaret's case might represent what physicists call a closed timeline curve, a theoretical situation in which events could influence their own past causes, creating stable loops across time. If time travel were possible, Dr. Rodriguez said, it would most likely occur in situations where the traveler's presence in the past was already part of the historical record, avoiding the logical paradoxes that would result from changing past events. This theoretical framework provided a possible explanation for Margaret's situation. If she had somehow traveled back to the 1940s as a child, her presence would have become part of the historical record that already existed in family photographs and memories. But Dr. Rodriguez also emphasized that such an explanation required accepting the possibility of phenomena that had no scientific foundation in current understanding of physics and temporal mechanics. Margaret's investigation reached a turning point when she discovered Dorothy's personal journal from the 1940s, hidden in a locked drawer in her grandmother's bedroom. The journal contained daily entries that provided Dorothy's own perspective on the mysterious child who had lived with her during those years. According to Dorothy's entries, little Margaret had appeared at her house in July 1941, claiming to be lost and unable to remember how she had gotten there. The child had been wearing modern clothes that Dorothy didn't recognize, and she had spoken using words and phrases that seemed unusually advanced for a 6-year-old. Margaret says things that make me think she's much older than she appears. Dorothy had written, she knows things about our family that she shouldn't know, and sometimes she talks about events that haven't happened yet. I wonder if she's been through some kind of trauma that has affected her memory. Dorothy's entries described her decision to care for Margaret as a temporary arrangement while she tried to locate the child's family. But as weeks turned into months, Dorothy had grown attached to Margaret and had begun to think of her as a permanent addition to the household. Margaret fits into our family as if she's always belonged here, Dorothy wrote. She knows where everything is kept. She remembers family stories I've never told her, and she has the same mannerisms as our other children. It's almost like she's a Thompson who was born in the wrong time. Most significantly, Dorothy's journal documented several instances when young Margaret had displayed knowledge about future events that proved accurate. Margaret had warned Dorothy about a kitchen fire that occurred exactly as predicted. She had told Dorothy which relatives would visit for Christmas before invitations had been sent. She had even described details about Dorothy's future grandchildren, including Margaret's own parents, years before those children were born. I'm beginning to believe that Margaret is not just a lost child. Dorothy had written in 1943. She seems to know things about our family's future that suggest she might be from a different time altogether. I don't understand how such a thing could be possible, but I can't explain her knowledge any other way. Dorothy's journal entries indicated that she had begun to suspect the truth about Margaret's identity during the child's final year with the family. In early 1945, Margaret had begun talking about needing to go home to a time and place that didn't exist yet. She had described her future parents, her birth in 1971, and her eventual career as a genealogist with such detail and consistency that Dorothy had started to believe the impossible. Margaret told me today that she would be born to my son William in 1971, and that she would grow up to help families understand their history. Dorothy wrote in March 1945. She said that someday she would find these photographs and use them to understand her own past. As impossible as it sounds, I'm beginning to believe that our little Margaret is actually my future granddaughter, somehow living with us before her proper time. The journal's final entry about young Margaret, dated April 1945, described the child's departure with the same mysterious circumstances that had marked her arrival. Margaret disappeared from her room during the night, just as suddenly as she appeared 4 years ago, Dorothy wrote. She left behind the clothes we had bought her, but she took the white flower dress she was wearing in our Christmas photograph. She said she needed to take something with her to prove she had really been here. Dorothy's journal revealed that she had spent decades wondering about the child who had lived with her during the 1940s, never knowing for certain whether Margaret had been real or whether the entire experience had been some kind of elaborate dream or psychological episode. I kept all of Margaret's photographs and documents because I needed proof that she had really existed. Dorothy had written years later, I always hoped that someday I would understand what happened to her and why she came to us when she did. Reading her grandmother's journal, Margaret realized that Dorothy had suspected the truth about her identity, but had never been able to confirm it. Dorothy had preserved the photographs and documents as evidence of Margaret's presence in the past, waiting for the day when her future granddaughter would be born and would eventually discover her own childhood spent in the 1940s. The discovery of Dorothy's journal completed Margaret's understanding of her impossible situation. She had somehow traveled back to the 1940s as a child, lived with her family for 4 years, and then returned to her proper time, leaving behind evidence of her presence that would eventually lead her to investigate her own past. But Margaret still had no memory of living during the 1940s, and she couldn't explain how such time travel could have occurred or why she had been chosen for such an extraordinary experience. Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychiatrist who specialized in memory and temporal perception, suggested that Margaret's lack of memory about her time in the past might be a protective mechanism designed to prevent psychological trauma or temporal paradoxes. If time travel were possible, Dr. Williams explained, the traveler's conscious memory of the experience might need to be suppressed to prevent them from making choices in their normal timeline that could alter the events they had already participated in during the past. If you made it all the way here, it means this story truly held you. So don't leave without showing some love. Hit like, subscribe to stay with us, and drop a comment. I'll be here, reading every word you share. This explanation suggested that Margaret's childhood time travel had been designed to preserve the stability of the timeline by ensuring that her adult self would discover the evidence without prior knowledge that could influence her investigation. Margaret's case attracted attention from researchers studying unexplained phenomena and temporal anomalies. She was interviewed by documentary filmmakers, consulted with paranormal investigators, and participated in academic conferences about time travel and historical mysteries. But for Margaret personally, the most important outcome of her investigation was the deeper understanding it provided about her connection to her family and her role in preserving their history. She realized that her career as a genealogist had been influenced by her unconscious memories of living with previous generations of her family. Her passion for family history and her intuitive understanding of generational relationships had been shaped by experiences she couldn't consciously remember, but that had fundamentally influenced her identity and interests. Margaret also understood that her discovery of the photographs had been part of a carefully orchestrated plan designed by her grandmother to ensure that the truth about Margaret's temporal journey would eventually be revealed. Dorothy had preserved the evidence and positioned it where Margaret would find it after Dorothy's death, creating a legacy that would help Margaret understand her extraordinary past. 5 years after discovering the photographs, Margaret had integrated her impossible history into her understanding of her own identity and family relationships. She continued to work as a genealogist, but with a deepened appreciation for the mysterious connections that could exist between different generations of the same family. Margaret's story became a case study in unexplained temporal phenomena, but it also became a testament to the enduring power of family bonds that could transcend the normal limitations of time and circumstance. She often reflected on the paradox of her situation. She had lived through experiences that she couldn't remember, but that had shaped her personality and interests throughout her life. The child who had appeared in the 1940s had influenced the adult she became in ways that created a stable loop across decades of time. I don't understand how I traveled back to the 1940s or why it happened, Margaret said during an interview about her case. But I understand now that my connection to my family is deeper and more complex than I ever imagined. The photographs don't just show where I've been. They show where I belong across multiple generations and multiple points in time. Margaret's discovery had revealed that human identity and family relationships could exist outside the normal boundaries of linear time, and that the most profound connections between people might transcend the limitations of birth, death, and the conventional sequence of generations. The woman who found herself in a 1943 photograph had learned that family history was not just about documenting the past, but about understanding the mysterious ways that past, present, and future could interconnect to create relationships that defied rational explanation, but that enriched human experience in ways that conventional family bonds could never achieve. Her story became a reminder that the deepest truths about human existence might be found not in scientific explanations, but in the willingness to accept the mysterious and impossible connections that could emerge when love and family commitment transcended the ordinary limitations of time, memory, and individual existence.